Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Along with me today, we have Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee, Reihan Salam, columnist for The Daily, MSNBC contributor Melissa Harris Perry, also of Tulane University and The Nation magazine, and Bob Herbert, formerly of the New York Times, now at the progressive think tank Demos. All right, so if you were watching one of the other cable news channels this morning, you might see a doomsday clock on the screen counting down the hours, minutes, and seconds until the much ballyhooed super committee blows their deadline. At the risk of sounding like a cable news heretic, I'm rooting for failure. I think creating jobs right now is far more urgent, pressing task than long-term fiscal balance. I think it probably will require deficit spending in the short term. I don't see any way out of that when we're up against the array of macroeconomic factors we are. I think history indicates that's what we need. But if the supercommittee succeeds and comes up with a deal to reduce the deficit by $1.5 trillion, I think that's over a 10-year scoring window, it will involve major cuts in government spending, accompanied by thousands of lost jobs and potentially major reductions in essential services to kids, families, and the elderly. If they fail, or if they fail to, the plan fails to pass Congress, it then triggers this, what they call sequestration process, which was part of the deal to get the debt ceiling passed, right? $1.2 trillion in automatic spending cuts, half coming from domestic programs, excluding Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and the other half from our national defense budget. Those cuts would kick in 2013. So that's the sort of situation. It looks like we are going towards the latter. Congressman Cohen, are you hoping for supercommittee failure?
Well, yeah, I guess in the way you generally look at failure, I consider Professor Krugman my guru, and I agree with you that we need to spend out of this, we need to create jobs, and we need to then the failure, quote unquote, would be a success because you'd end up eliminating the Bush tax cuts, which could take care of the problem in and of itself. And the Bush tax cuts put us at rates that are unheard of in 60 years. And the disparity in wealth is the greatest it's been in this country maybe forever. I saw something today. Memphis is the fourth largest disparity gap in the country, tied with Houston. I hate to be tied with Houston in anything. and you know, this is not fair what's going on.
But to take it one step further, so let's say that they don't reach a deal, which now looks like they did. I never understood why anyone thought they would. They created
I couldn't agree more.
I mean, they created this process in which they had
gonna happen.
Yeah, well, why would it be the case if you take two bodies and then you make them 50-50, right, between two very polarized parties that represent very different constituencies and have very different ideological commitments and visions of the way forward, and you put them together? I don't understand why anyone thought you would get anything other than this. But if there is nothing out of the supercommittee, how do you then deal with the cuts that are coming down the line in the discretionary domestic budget?
Well, the sequestration will be devastating to social programs, and that's what I'm most concerned about. I think it's good that the defense is being cut. I think defense needs to be cut, and we spent too much money there. And if defense is cut, maybe we'll realize, okay, it would be smarter to put money into electric batteries to create cars and charging systems so that we don't have to depend on the Fifth Fleet being there to protect the Straits of Hormuz. Right. It'd be better to protect our country internally. And Fred Smith, guru of one other, the guru, Federal Express founder and president, talked about this
constituent
last week.
I believe, right?
He is a constituent. Talked about this at the Aspen Institute last week, that we need to do more with electric cars, and we should take it out of the defense budget because defense is about oil. So the defense needs to be cut and won't be otherwise because, as you've discussed, the problems with Congress, defense has put money into it. They've got their power. They know where to go on appropriations committee. They've got a defense. You vote on budgets oftentimes is who's got the jobs. And the GE calls, well, we got jobs in your district. The other, we got jobs in your district. And it ought to be about the big picture of, do we need that engine or not?
But Bob, you've been watching this supercommittee mishegas unfold. What do you think?
Well, I think your introduction to this segment, I mean, you should just put it on a card and mail it to every voter in the country. Jobs is the number one problem facing the country right now. And austerity is in the short term especially, is a job killer. So I'm like you. I'm rooting for this committee to fail, but you have to be concerned, as the congressman is pointing out, about this sequestration process. Hey, I said it without about this process coming down and who's actually going to get clobbered if it's allowed to go forward. But I have a question. What could Congress do, assume this supercommittee fails, to alleviate the potential damage of the sequestration process.
Well, we could change afterwards. We could vote to make things different. And the problem is, what everybody figures would happen is that defense would come out the winner.
Right.
And one of the scenarios I've seen is that they would vote not to cut defense so much and to cut the social services more, that there'd be enough votes in the House, which obviously would because the Republicans are in control there. They would do it. And also you've got Democratic people who have districts that depend on defense jobs, and that's important. And then in the Senate, it probably would happen. And then the question is, the president would veto that, and is there two-thirds to override the president's veto? I'd hope not. Well, some think it won't, some think it would.
Reihan.
But defense would be the first thing that would be sacrosanct.
I think the congressman made a very astute point earlier on in saying that cutting defense expenditures might actually create a reprioritization. And I think that that's the broad question, and that's the idea that's advanced by many of us on the right. The idea that actually sometimes that kind of spending restraint can lead to greater financial discipline and organizational discipline. You get a better sense of what are your real priorities. Are there better, more effective ways to deploy spending than we've done so in the past? And I think that that is why I'm somewhat more optimistic about the prospect of spending cuts, provided there are also institutional reforms that allow us to reform, for example, work rules and other practices that make it harder for us to reprioritize spending.
I want to bring into this conversation, because we have him on the line, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, and he's voiced concern for the impact that any supercommittee spending cuts will have on the elderly and on working families. He joins us now from his home state of Ohio. Welcome back to the program, Senator.
Good to be back, Chris. Thanks.
Senator, what do you think of what the developments in the supercommittee? Are you hoping that they do not reach a deal and we get the sequestration eventuality, or do you want to see something come out of the supercommittee?
Well, I'd like to see a deal, but I can't imagine that the Republicans who have signed their vote away, signed their ability to think in some sense away to Grover Norquist, that will ever come to a deal on any significant kinds of revenues and any significant defense cuts and any fairness in what they do with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. So I'm not optimistic that it will be any kind of a deal that would work frankly, for a majority of the Senate. I mean, as Steve said, the House is another ballgame there. And I think that, and there are some other things floating around in this supercommittee. One of the things that there seemed to be overwhelming Republican support for, and I hope not, but perhaps a few Democrats, is to change the cost of living adjustment, to change the CPI and ratchet it downward, doing something called chain CPI instead of capturing a fairer CPI than we've said. As you know, seniors haven't had a cost of living increase. They got one this year, 3.5%. Hadn't had one for 2 years, and that's because when the government calculates a consumer price index, they don't weigh health care costs that affect seniors, obviously, is a much bigger part of their income than it does someone in his 30s or in her 40s. So they're going the wrong way on many issues. That would be one of them. That's what makes me pessimistic and what makes me think that likely this will move forward into sequestration. And as Congressman Cohen pointed out, what can happen then?
You talked about Republicans' desire not to increase taxes. The last reported plan, we have a graphic here set up that gives you a sense of what the sort of composition of what Republicans proposed as reported to the supercommittee. It's a pie chart we've put together. No, it's not that. That's projected government spending. But that we'll talk about in a second. This is a pie chart I want to show you of the composition of the GOP debt plan, and it only contains, there we go, 99.5% of the plan was spending cuts and other revenue from things like selling spectrum and selling things. 0.5% of the plan, that little green sliver there, was actually new taxes. That gives you a sense of the composition of what they want. Senator,
well, that would be considered fair and balanced, all right?
Well, Senator, do you think that that Democrats have not been forthright enough in their rhetoric about taxes? Do you think that part of the issue here is that Democrats are in such a defensive crouch that they have a hard time making an affirmative case for taxes?
Well, I think Democrats are in a defensive crouch generally too often, and I think that voters respond to us. Voters respond to us when we make the contrast, as many of us have that have run as progressives in states that are considered swing states, and you make that case as a progressive. You make that contrast, whether it's the Iraq War, whether it's Medicare, whether it's taxes, whether it's defense. and voters rally around. I think you saw that with issue 2 in Ohio, when nobody thought we'd win by 22 points, when the radical takeover of the legislature and the governor repealed collective bargaining rights. They've gone after women's rights and voter rights, and in Washington we see what's happening with taxes. And the more the Democrats make that contrast, I think the better we do.
Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, I want you to stay right where you are, and we're going to continue this discussion with.
Sure.
We have representatives from each of the houses of Congress here today on the program, which is a treat. We're going to talk more about it right after this.
Thanks.
We're back with Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio. Senator Brown was one of 3 sitting Democratic senators explicitly named in the memo from the lobbying firm CLGC, written to their client, the American Bankers Association, proposing an $850,000 campaign against Occupy Wall Street. Another one of those senators named in there was Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. Senator Casey's office had this comment on the report. They told us Senator Casey is not surprised that big bank lobbyists are once again trying to use their money and influence to protect the wealthiest few at the expense of hardworking Pennsylvanians. Senator Brown, I wanted to see if you had any reaction.
Well, first, congratulations on breaking that story. I was out and about in Columbus last night. My wife Connie and I were, and we heard a real buzz about this story and how the good journalism in getting this memo. Apparently, the consulting group that made the proposal, the American Bankers Association, has a lot of connections with John Boehner's office. I guess that shouldn't surprise us at all. But I think the important issue there is it's clear that the 99% group on Occupy Wall Street has really tapped into a real fear and concern and anxiety in this country. And they have said more persuasively, regardless of what exactly happens on the streets, they have said more persuasively than anybody how big a deal it is, how terrible and troublesome it is for the country that we have this huge gap, and the middle class is shrinking. A very small number of people are getting wealthier and wealthier. People are falling out of the middle class. People that aspire to be in the middle class are seeing doors shut in their face right and left. They can't afford to go to school. They just can't get ahead. The foreclosures, all those things. And yet the bank lobby, the Wall Street lobby, is empowered to do even more to hold their place and to get more tax cuts and more deregulation and to do the same things that a lot of the Republicans on the super committee want to do. And I think it's clear from Occupy Wall Street and what happened in Ohio on issue 2 to beat back the efforts to repeal collective bargaining that the country's saying no more to this, and the middle class is going to fight back.
Do you see this coming election being fundamentally framed as a referendum in those terms? Is that what you think? Is that the strategy that you're going to be pursuing as you face re-election? Do you think that's going to be the strategy broadly pursued by your colleagues in the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I think it ultimately comes down this year, as it does in most elections, although not nearly enough of my colleagues articulate it this way, I think, is whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the Wall Street bankers? Or are you on the side of Main Street? Are you on the side of the insurance companies that would like to privatize Medicare? Or are you on the side of Medicare beneficiaries that didn't get a cost of living adjustment for 2 years? I think that you make those contrasts and you ultimately point out whose side are you on, and that's really the fear that John Boehner and Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney immediately said it was class warfare when he was first asked about Occupy Wall Street. The class warfare in this country has been from the elite aimed at the middle class. They commit class warfare every day in Congress, and every day as they outsource jobs, and every day as they try to privatize Social Security. We just point out that they're committing class warfare, and they accuse us of class warfare. And I don't want class warfare. I just want the middle class to have a fighting chance. And that means to tell the 1% to back off when they ask for more tax cuts and more deregulation and more privatization of public functions like Social Security and Medicare and many of the things that the states do.
Senator Brown, Bob Herbert here wanted to ask you a question.
Hi, Senator. I'll ask you the same thing I asked Congressman Cohen. If the super committee fails, what do you see unfolding in the Senate after that?
Yeah, I heard part of Steve's answer to that question. I think that, clearly John McCain's already said this, and others will fight any cuts in defense spending. I think when you look at what we've done in defense and the increases in the last 10 years during the Bush years, and when it's important, as I think we need to accelerate our withdrawal from Afghanistan and Iraq. We shouldn't be spending the kind of money there. I'm concerned about the president's move into Australia. I don't know enough yet to question that as directly as I might, because I don't know what he's doing with moving troops around yet. I don't think any of that's determined. And I think the defense establishment can absorb some significant cuts. I appreciated the comments that Steve Cohen's constituent Fred Smith said that we should be using some of the defense establishment, some of the defense dollars to do things like batteries and some other kinds of advancements. And the Defense Department over the years does create a lot of jobs, but $1 billion in defense spending versus $1 billion for teachers and police officers is not really much of a comparison.
Senator, you mentioned Senator John McCain, and we have a little bit of sound of him because I think this to me is sort of the heart of the issue. The idea here, just so everyone's tracking this, was that Congress was going to, like Ulysses, tie itself to the mast, right? And then that would force it to make a decision. And immediately, as we saw the super committee start to break down, people coming out saying, well, we could just untie ourselves from the mast. This is John McCain saying, I'm going to move forward. Here he is talking about defense spending.
My reaction is that if there's a failure on the part of the super committee, that we will be amongst the first on the floor to nullify that provision. The Congress is not bound by this. It's something we passed. We can reverse it. As far as I'm concerned, I will fight any additional cuts in defense spending.
This does feel a little like Lucy in the football. I mean, why did we go through this whole thing? I mean, I guess my question is to you, Congressman Cohen, and to you, Senator. People say, well, the sequestration process is going to kick in, and it's going to require the president will veto it if it doesn't have the cuts. But they're going to come at Democrats with everything they have about cutting defense spending, and that has been a very persuasive and politically potent argument through the years. If it weren't, we wouldn't have the defense spending we have now. So if it's put back on the table once the super committee process fails, what is to ensure that we're not just going to see everybody cave and run to the House floor and Senate floor to vote to get rid of these defense cuts?
Well, there's no question that defense seats, like an American, you salute and strong. And John McCain, I'm sure, feels that way as a pilot and a hero.
Right.
But at the same time, there's a lot of defense contractors in Arizona.
Right.
And so there's a lot of jobs, and there's a lot of money, and there's a lot of influence, and they have that spread throughout the nation, and it makes it difficult. I'm going to be against maybe it's because we don't have it in Memphis,
right.
But I just think we fundamentally don't need to be known around the world as a defense company. We're an army. We should be known for innovation. We should be known for other things, and we're falling behind in so many areas. And innovation is one of the areas we're falling behind, creating jobs with green jobs. We're letting the Chinese beat us. Our infrastructure is falling apart. Infrastructure creates jobs.
Melissa.
But Chris, you've asked this question in two different ways, and also to the senator here. I mean, one was a policy question you asked us initially. Do you want the super committee to fail because we might end up with better policy outcomes? But then you asked a political question, both just now and earlier to the senator, about is this going to be the framework for the 2012 elections? And with all due respect, the framework of the 2012 elections is going to be the presidential election.
Right.
And so I suppose my question to both the congressman and the senator is, look, this is going to be about whether or not President Obama is going to be seen as the leader of this party, whether or not he's going to be seen as having strong support, and whether or not you guys are going to help to give him the coattails necessary to actually get back in and to potentially keep and hold a Democratic Senate and maybe some gains in the House. And so I'm wondering what that relationship is at this moment, going into 2012, thinking about the potential failure of the
Senator, please.
Yeah, I think a couple of things temper the question, the original question of what happens with defense spending during sequestration and McCain's comments. Number one, this president has taken off the table the Democrats are weak on defense argument when considering what he's done in the war on terror. He did things that in Libya, he's done obviously with Osama bin Laden, he's done things that George Bush, who talked a lot tougher but carried a pretty small stick when you get right down to it. He's done things that his predecessors did. And so I think Democrats, just by definition now, because of the White House, have much more credibility on defense. And it doesn't mean you have to spend and spend and spend and spend to do it. The second thing out there, the second thing sort of at the end of the line here is While McCain says he's going to change this before January 2013 when sequestration goes into effect if the super committee fails, don't forget that same date is when the Bush tax cuts expire. So they're going to try to play it both ways. They're going to try to continue the Bush tax cuts for the rich and eliminate the defense cuts. And John McCain ain't going to get it both ways.
Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio, second time on up. We really appreciate you getting up early on Sunday morning and joining us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you again for breaking the Occupy Wall Street story. That was really important.
Appreciate it, Senator. Thank you so much. We will be right back after this.
The bottom line is America must reduce its borrowing. That is a fact. And we must cut spending on things that we all like. If we do not, companies won't hire, our economy won't grow, interest rates will one day go up. A lot. On mortgages, on credit cards, on any kind of loan, on everyone.
All right, so that's Erin Burnett sort of laying out, I think, succinctly the case for this kind of long-term austerity vision. Reihan, as self-described ambassador from the other side of the ideological spectrum, there's a case embedded in what Erin Burnett was saying there about how I think there's a case that was made in the run-up to the debt ceiling deal that basically went as follows. The long-term CBO fiscal projections of deficits in the out years are producing right now in this moment uncertainty, anxiety, paralysis among the job creators that is at the cause of the stalled recovery. Do you think that's a strong argument?
Well, the argument that I find more compelling relates actually to an argument that Representative Cohen had raised earlier on. When he was talking about defense expenditures, he mentioned that, look, these guys are very pervasively spread. They have a lot of facilities in a lot of different congressional districts. And that creates a dynamic in which we tend to spend more and more. There's an upward ratchet. And also, they've kind of deployed their resources effectively to make themselves a very strong political coalition. Now, I would argue that if you look, for example, at medical providers, you see an even more pervasive political coalition in which you have situations where we say, okay, we're going to cut X amount of spending on sort of medical needs, et cetera. Now, that is interpreted through the political process as you're attacking people who want medical care rather than saying, well, let's raise some questions about medical providers, wages for physicians, the cost of training physicians, among other things. That reflects this variety of guild rules and other protections that government exacerbates. So I'd say that regardless of what you say about overall spending levels, the question is the structure working? And when people say we're going to make cuts, well, where's the wedge? Is it partly medical providers that are extracting, and sometimes it's explicitly extracting in the form of profits, but other times it's extracting in the form of profits that are not visible, in the form of feather bedding, that is employing more people than you need for a given function, and also just kind of employees who are capturing rents?
There's a distinction that you bring up there between particularly Medicare, between the provider side and the citizen side, right? The recipient side, and that's actually something.
The recipient cares about getting high quality medical care rather than about how much these people are extracting.
Right, and I think there was a distinction made, and my understanding is that in the sequestration process there are cuts to providers, right? That is part of the sequestration process. Am I wrong about that?
Oh, no, that is true, but of course that's a kind of very hard thing to kind of.
Right, yeah. and you raise what is essentially the central question, which I think we end up talking around. I think the long-term austerity conversation gets made in these very moralistic terms. America has lost its virtue, it's lost its sort of prudence, it's lost its ability to restrain itself. It is kind of gorged, and now is the time to purge, right? That's the moral language we use to talk about austerity. The long-term problem in the budget is one thing. It is healthcare costs. It is rising healthcare costs. Here's a great chart put together by the Bipartisan Policy Council that shows what the sources of our long-term fiscal challenges are, and there you go. It's Social Security is not the problem. Discretionary spending is not the problem. Rising healthcare costs are the problem.
And the Democrats dealt with that in passing the health care bill. The health care bill will reduce long-term health care costs, and it's the first time Democrats have dealt with the deficit before. We dealt with it with President Clinton. It was a great victory. All Democrats balanced the budget or put the budget on the way to being balanced in 1993. And then we dealt with it with the health care. The Republicans have never done anything really to try to balance the budget. They've had two wars off of a budget, Afghanistan and Iraq. They put these Bush tax cuts in effect. That's the reason we've got this great deficit. And it's kind of like, when they,
Let's also remember Medicare Part D, which
that's a Bush.
Yes, and Tim Carney in the Washington Examiner did great reporting on Newt Gingrich actually lobbying for, or at least calling around Capitol Hill and pushing for Medicare Part D, which was not paid for at all, which was just a new entitlement for seniors.
We're seeing some bipartisan support.
Sure.
The Democratic proposal was more expensive.
Yes, the Democrats support it, sure.
The great story about the child who kills his parents and then has the chutzpah to say, but I'm an orphan and feel sorry for me. That's the Republicans saying, look at the deficit. They caused the deficit, and they're forgetting all about it. That's chutzpah.
But I might disagree a little bit about whether we've dealt with healthcare costs with the president's healthcare reform plan.
Thank you, sir.
And healthcare costs are obviously an important issue, long-term deficits. But also, we're talking like we're in fantasy land somewhere. At some point, you're going to have to raise taxes. You have to raise revenues. At some point, you're going to have to stop fighting these endless, unfunded wars if you're going to get a handle on budget deficits. And perhaps most importantly, you're going to have to do something about the economy that puts people back to work so that you have ordinary people paying taxes again. So you need all those factors in play in addition to doing something
paying taxes
about
and consuming goods. Because if the middle class can't buy goods, you're going to be in a recession.
And I suppose I would also go back to the initial question you asked about, okay, it's creating this uncertainty in this moment, which is attacking basically private sector job creation. But when we look at what's happened just over the past couple of years, so that may have been true sort of early on, but over the past couple of years, it hasn't been the private sector that is shedding jobs at this rate. It's actually been the public sector shedding jobs, and primarily as a result of not so much federal policy, although that's critically part of it.
The absence of federal help.
But the absence of federal help to states and localities. And so what you see is often Republican, but not exclusively Republican governors that are shedding these public sector jobs over the course of the past years. And so, it does go to the fact that we exist in a consumption economy. When we talk about the middle class, all of that, those are government workers. But a government worker is someone who brings you your mail and teaches your kid and puts out your fire.
Right.
Reihan wants to respond to that. I'm going to let him do just that after we take this break. All right, Reihan Salam of the Daily, among other institutional affiliations. You're a man of many credentials. You wanted to respond, so I want to give you a chance.
Well, Melissa raised a very good point that much of what we've seen is we've seen shedding in the public sector, specifically the state and local sector. But there are two things to keep in mind about that. One is that between the end of the Korean War and 2009, while federal expenditures have remained relatively stable, state and local expenditures doubled as a share of GDP. Over the last decade, state and local expenditures increased by about 8%, and there's a tremendous burst of hiring during that period as well. Another thing to keep in mind is that states where they were able to shift the compensation mix from deferred compensation to salaries or what have you.
Meaning pensions.
Exactly. Are states where actually there have been fewer layoffs than states where actually there's been resistance. So, for example, if you see Illinois shed large numbers of public sector workers, while Wisconsin in the last year did not shed large numbers of public sector workers. That's obviously quite controversial, but I think that is another element of the story. Do these state governments have the flexibility in order to deploy their funds differently?
And at the same time that state and local government has grown, and it has. That actually is where, if you want to look at where the growth of government is.
The economy did not grow at 8% over the last decade, and state and local spending.
State and local government has grown. The federal government really hasn't as a percentage of GDP. At the same time,
going to take
the share of taxes as percentage of GDP at the federal level is the lowest level it's been since the 1950s.
So it's tied to the business cycle.
But part of that growth in state and local was about the unfunded mandates of federal government to states and localities under the guise of a Republican notion of localism, right? This idea that local people know better.
Unfunded mandates were also opposed by many conservatives as well, and I think that certainly that evolution is a complex one. But a lot of it's also the desire for smaller class sizes and many other things that I think are kind of widely shared across the political spectrum, wrongly in my view. But yes.
And yet, I suspect that, as we're sort of looking at for example, the Medicare costs and the effect that's going to have on states and localities, I think part of what's going to happen, and it's undoubtedly going to happen because the Supreme Court is going to reassess under the U.S. Commerce Clause this question of the health care reform individual mandate. And whatever else it does, it is going to lead us to have a conversation about the appropriate relationship between the various levels of government. There is no other way for this to happen happen. And I keep calling it the personhood amendment possibility, because so much of, for example, civil rights law, of our sex registration, all of that happens under an assumption about what the federal government can and cannot ask localities and states to do.
Right. Absolutely.
And this
balance
is all,
of power between
this
state
is
and federal
all
government is a big question.
all up for play right now.
Yeah.
Do you think that the politics of this moment, it seems to me that one of the things that characterizes the politics moment, we're talking about the politics of a moment of austerity, but also a moment of low growth and shrinking pie, that there's a sort of different tenor to that politics. They're more brutal, they're more zero sum. Do you feel that in Congress?
Well, I think you've got to have concern for people that are not participating in the American dream. You've got the upper 1%, the Dow's over 12,000. The Dow doesn't affect most people in my district. They need jobs. They need help with public education. They need help with public health. The disparity has grown over the last 10, 15 years, and that's when you've had more emphasis on local governments having to deal with these issues. And so it's come back, corrections, all the different issues, second chance. You mentioned people that don't have jobs. We need to get second chance opportunities, but we're not doing enough with that. But there's so much more at the street level that needs to be done.
But let me ask you this question. Yes, I think, well, I'll speak for myself. We need jobs desperately. I mean, the employment crisis is as profound and debilitating and grinding and miserable as certainly we've seen in my lifetime, and I think since the Great Depression. I think at this point, the tenor, the characteristics of this employment crisis are the worst since the Great Depression. But when you think about waking up every day and going to the United States Capitol, it doesn't seem like anything's going to happen in the next 12 months. I mean, I just can't see a way forward to alleviate the jobs crisis.
I don't think it's going to happen because Mitch McConnell said our main job is to defeat President Obama. And that's what the Republicans have done in the last 2 years, is to do things to not help the economy, not help the American people, not, even though they read the Constitution of the first week, not to care about the public interest.
Okay, so I want to just press you on this. I think there's two theories of Republican opposition to, say, the American Jobs Act. The good faith theory is that they think it's bad legislation that won't work. The bad faith theory is that they think it's legislation that will work and they don't want it to work because that would lead to President Obama's reelection. Which of those do you subscribe to?
Well, I mean, it could go either way, and depending on the Republican, they could look at it either way. But it's funded by taxing the upper 1%, the tax on millionaires, and they don't want to tax millionaires. Their whole game is to keep the wealthy. I'm rich as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. That's where they're at. It's the hospital. It's part two. It's good.
Bob Herbert, I cut you off.
Well, I agree with Chris. I don't think anything's going to happen over the next 12 months, but I would make the timeline even longer than that. And I think the implications are pretty profound because the jobs crisis is as serious as you say. If we continue the way we're going, you're going to have an increase in the inequality that people are finally beginning to talk about. But more important than that is there's going to be a destabilizing aspect to the society, which I think we're already beginning to see. And we're not addressing it at all.
You're not addressing it. And that conference they had in Iowa, that little group that was all concerned about social issues, and they said, marriage is falling apart and this is terrible and terrible. Well, part of the reason people aren't saying it's because of jobs.
That's exactly right.
If you don't have a job, you're less likely to have, and they didn't bring that up at all. Jobs weren't part of it.
You're starting to see in rural areas and in Rust Belt communities and in some of the older suburbs many of the problems that we've long associated with the inner cities in the United States.
I should know one statistic, which was in the New York Times today. The census has computed these new poverty numbers. We talked about them yesterday, and the new poverty numbers, which give a more accurate picture of poverty, they're good news at the level of extreme poverty, which is there's less people in extreme poverty than the old number said because it didn't take into account government transfers, but there are far more people at the near poverty level, and as many as 100 million in the sort of near poverty. That's a third of every American. Melissa?
Yeah, I just want to, so the only danger that we have, or an important danger I think we have when we make the claim that the issue is about making sure that President Obama is not reelected, which in many ways I'm very suspicious that, in fact, that sort of second scenario is true. They think it's good and they just don't want him to get reelected. My only anxiety about that is then it assumes, well, as much as we like President Obama, we're just going to have to let him go, because if we shed President Obama, then they'll bring in President Romney, President Gingrich, and because they'll all be on the same side and they do recognize that this is good policy, they'll go ahead and pass it. And so even though it'll be bad for the Democratic Party and maybe bad for President Obama, it'll be good for all of us. And I just really want to caution us against even implying that if we just get rid of President Obama, then the Republicans will be able to breathe a deep sigh of relief and they'll make jobs. I think that's...
I agree with you. I agree with you on that. Okay, what you should know for the news week ahead, coming up next. In just a second, what you should know for the week ahead. But right now, it's time for a preview of Weekends with Alex Witt. Alex, what's coming up this morning?
Well, let me get to that. It's an outcry. It's outrage, Chris. Also now an investigation. Could these pictures of police cracking down on protesters in California spark the Occupy Wall Street movement? We're going to talk to the U.S. congressman whose district includes Zuccotti Park. A Thanksgiving gathering for the GOP. Some surprise moments that brought tears from at least two of the candidates. Did anyone clearly win this non-debate? Plus, the changing retail landscape and Black Friday. One article this morning suggests it's going to alter how we celebrate and view Thanksgiving. I don't know if I'm ready for that, but it is all ahead at 10 Eastern.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay.
So, what should you know as we head into the week? Well, you should know in the past 12 years, total lobbying spending in Washington has gone up 240%, from $1.4 billion to $3.5 billion. And you should know that no matter what anyone tells you, the exploding growth of Washington's economy of influence represents a metastasizing cancer on our democracy. You should know that in all likelihood, the super committee will not come to an agreement. And all things considered, you should know that's better than the alternative. You should also know that Republicans will immediately pivot towards undoing the very deal they made that would lock in fairly significant cuts to military spending. And you should know you're going to see the worst, most craven kind of demagoguery leveled at members of Congress if they don't go along with rolling back the military cuts. You should know Michelle Bachmann's memoir will be released this week, giving her an early opportunity to transition from candidate to industry, a path already lucratively trod by Sarah Palin, Herman Cain, and others. While banksters continue to go unpunished and unprosecuted, those worrying about the vigor of American justice should know about the story of Anita McLemore. A federal judge in Mississippi sentenced the mother of two to 3 years in federal prison for the grave crime of lying on a federal application for food stamps. McLemore had been previously convicted of drug offenses, which made her ineligible for food stamps, but she lied about this fact on her application so she could feed her children. You should know the total cost of this fraud was $4,367, and you should know she has paid it back in its entirety, but that will not spare her from 3 years in prison. You should know the National Press Club has a funny definition of journalism. After journalist Sam Husseini asked Saudi Prince Turki a tough question about his kingdom's autocratic, misogynistic record, Husseini received a letter from the club suspending his membership for 2 weeks for violating their house rule against, quote, boisterous, unseemly conduct. And you should know that if the rest of our press showed the same spirit of boisterous unseemliness, we would likely be in much better shape as a country. You should know that a week after police used their batons to beat nonviolent student protesters at UC Berkeley, confiscating their tents from in front of Sproul Hall, some enterprising students found a way around the university's prohibitions on Occupy Cal. In up fashion, they used balloons to float their tents over Sproul Hall. You should know ingenuity is probably Occupy's greatest asset. And finally, as we approach Thanksgiving, you should know how genuinely and profoundly thankful I am that you take time to watch our program. All of us here at UP are grateful for your viewership, and that especially extends to conservatives on Twitter who can't stand anything we say, but watch anyway. Happy Thanksgiving. My guests are going to come back and tell us what they think we should know this week, right after this. I like bumping back with the shot of the pastries, which everyone seems obsessed with. We actually got eaten today, thanks to myself and Reihan Salam. All right, our guests are back to tell us what we should know as the news unfolds this week. I'm going to start with Congressman Steve Cohen from Memphis, Tennessee. Congressman, what should folks know as we head into the week?
I guess they should know that whatever happens with this, the quote-unquote super committee, that the country will continue and go on, that most of the members of Congress, even though our rating is down, are good human beings who, whether they have difference of opinions, but want to do the right thing. Most people are good. There's only a certain small percentage that are bad apples, and they get a lot of attention.
Do you want to name them right here on live television? I'm kidding.
Obviously not. And that, you know, on Thanksgiving we need to give thanks, and for those who've been given much as expected, and I think that those people who are having their, you know, catered and wonderfully Thanksgiving dinners with all the trimmings should think about those that don't, and they should write their congressperson and say, vote for taxes on me. There were a bunch of millionaires that came to the Hill this week that said, we want to be taxed more and we should. And that was the right. Warren Buffett's right. He says there's been class warfare and my class is winning. And on this Thanksgiving, people ought to think about the people that don't have Thanksgiving, don't have jobs, don't have health care, are homeless, veterans that come home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and to give more and sacrifice. And they ought to know the Memphis Tigers can have the best basketball team in the United States of America.
All right. Reihan Salam of The Daily.
There's a terrible legislative proposal called the Stop Online Piracy Act that's making its way through the House right now. And, one way to think about this is when you look at the extraordinary expenditures of Hollywood and the recording industry versus the quite modest expenditures by the technology industry that suffers the most grievously from these kinds of proposals. Recently, an independent expenditure group called Priorities USA Action has started, making ads attacking potential Republican presidential candidates. It's a group that's raised $3 million, $2 million of which come from the pockets of Jeffrey Katzenberg, the renowned Hollywood producer. And so it's a way in which these guys have captured both political coalitions. Fortunately, a coalition of right-of-center and left-of-center groups is trying to fight the Stop Online Piracy Act, and that's very good news. The other thing I'd mention is that I recently had the pleasure of finishing the most intelligent and keenly observed novel of the past year, which hasn't made it onto nearly enough top 10 lists, called Open City by Teju Cole. I recommend it strongly to everyone who is inclined to read fiction.
That's great. We should do more reading recommendations on the show. I should just so people are clear, Priorities USA is a democratically aligned independent group. They are not
two White House veterans,
right? But they are not actually doing anything on the Stop Online Piracy Act. Just so people are clear, that's not their brief. Melissa Harris Perry.
Yeah. So I think as we're at our Thanksgiving tables and as we're thinking about sort of our sets of values, we should remember that a nation's values are always very clear in our tax code. It is the single most important collective way that we measure what our values are. And if you look at the tax rate for millionaires, right at the end of World War II, at the sort of moment of the greatest generation and the great expansion of the American middle class, the tax rate on millionaires was 66.4%. Democrat and Republican presidents and Congresses have been cutting that, and it is now at about 30%. And so what we see now with this shrinking middle class and with a glance at our own tax code is that there has been an enormous shift in American priorities over the course of the past 60 years away from an expansion of the middle class.
Bob Herbert.
We've known for a long time that the middle class has been squeezed. Now we're getting census data documenting that the middle class is actually shrinking. There are fewer and fewer people living in middle-class neighborhoods, and as you touched on earlier, now we've got reports that there are more and more people in the near-poor category. So between the poor and the near-poor, that covers about 1/3 of all Americans.
Yeah, 100 million people, as we said before. Mm-hmm. This is a running story on Up with Chris Hayes. We're sort of obsessed with these new census poverty numbers. Yeah. But it gives really a striking picture of where we are, particularly as the Great Recession continues to grind on and continues to create tremendous misery broadly, but intensely acute pockets of misery, particularly among certain subpopulations. Right. I want to thank my guest today, Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee. Absolute great pleasure to have you here. I hope you come back. Reihan Salam of The Daily, MSNBC contributor Melissa Harris Perry, and Bob Herbert from Demos Think Tank. Thank you all. I hope you guys all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next Saturday at 7 Eastern Time and Sunday at 8. Our guests will include Nancy Giles and Ezra Klein. So set your DVRs now, people. In the meantime, you can keep up with us on Facebook at Up with Chris. Up next is Alex Witt. You guys have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next week here on Up.